Good morning, everyone. Thank you for that presentation, Gabrielle. It's really, I'm sure all those points in terms of priorities resonate with all of you. Climate change, changing that from strategy to actual implementation, building back better in terms of our town centers, housing affordability. I've lived in Sydney now for 9 years. From the very first day that I moved to Sydney, this has been in the agenda. People have been complaining about this and suffering from this. Hopefully, this year is the year that we can actually make a dent in that for the better, as opposed to making it even worse in the future. My name is Princess Ventura. I'm the Regional Director for New South Wales at Urbis. Hopefully, most of you are familiar with Urbis. For those of you who are not, we're a multidisciplinary consulting firm. We operate from 8 offices across Australia and in Singapore. And at Urbis, we really have one simple goal. It's to connect the brightest minds to shape cities and communities for a better future. So it is my absolute delight that we were able to be one of the sponsors of today's summit. And it's my absolute pleasure as well to welcome and introduce our next speaker, the Honourable Rob Stokes, Minister for Infrastructure, Cities and Active Transport. I'm sure he is no stranger to most of us. He's very well known for his enthusiastic championing of reforms under his most recent portfolios, planning and transport. We at Urbis were privileged enough to be able to work with the department on a number of those reforms. As an economist, it's always music to my ears whenever I've heard the minister speak about outcomes-based, evidence-based decision-making. Nothing would make me happier than to hear him eloquently talk to us about how he's going to continue that culture change throughout government. Some of those reforms included simplifying the complying development pathway. So for those of you who are familiar with the New South Wales planning system, it is the most expeditious way in which you can get a development through for non-residential developments, to working with the department on providing guidance to councils to promote consistency, to enable our employment lands in developing their strategies to be more fit for the future, to the work that we're still currently working with them, which is the most ambitious thing that the minister announced, I believe, and spoke to very passionately at the end of last year, which was probably the last time that I've heard him speak under that portfolio on rezonings. How do we make rezonings more expedient? How do we make them more timely? How do we make them more consistent across the different councils, as well as how do we improve the timing and accountability around those? Today, I'm sure this morning, like me, you're really excited to hear from the minister under his own new portfolio on what his new remit is. There are all these different names now. What is active transport? How is that different from transport? What is cities? Is that different from planning? Are some of the questions I'm sure that you have in mind. What's his remit? 2, how is he going to build the reforms that he started under his past portfolios? And last but not the least, of course, what grand plans does he have now? And what wicked problems is he going to tackle to make sure that our city is even more fantastic in the future than it already is? So, ladies and gentlemen, Minister Rob Stokes.
Thank you, Princess, and thank you to Urbis and the other sponsors of today's event. Thank you to Michael Rose as chair of the Committee for Sydney, and to Gabrielle and his amazing team at the Committee for Sydney. Thanks for bringing us all together and providing us this opportunity to talk about things that are important for all of us, for our friends, for our families, for our colleagues, and for future generations as well. What a time to serve as the state's first Minister for Infrastructure, Cities and Active Transport. A perfect storm of economic, social and environmental disruption and dislocation provides a time of terrible uncertainty, but also incredible opportunity for urban society. Now's the moment to be developing the big ideas that'll support the future of metropolitan New South Wales and the great urban centres around Sydney, the Central Coast, Newcastle and Wollongong. While cities have been the crucible of invention and progress for centuries, the pandemic reminds us all that no city is immune from maladies which might attack its prosperity and prospects. We now have an extraordinary opportunity to truly reshape our cities as places for people. Our government has proven it's not afraid to remove red tape and implement reform to allow things like outdoor dining, pop-up cycleways, pedestrianised streets, and far more liberal planning rules for shop fronts, for retail businesses, to allow for flexibility for change between land use despite zoning instruments, and new forms of housing like build to rent and rent to buy. Polycentric and multifunctional cities will bounce back stronger than those that have all of their eggs in one basket. That's why, for example, I believe Sydney has a fundamentally more resilient metropolitan form than our competitor in Melbourne, because our city region has multiple large commercial cores, while Melbourne really has everyone going to the same area all at the same time. One of my first tasks as Minister for Cities will be to help shape both a unitary and separate vision for the 6 cities of the New South Wales metropolitan region, and deliver the Premier's 6 cities vision for the Greater Cities Commission, which extends the scope of urban planning beyond Greater Sydney to include the mega region of Central Coast, Newcastle and Wollongong, all the way from Port Stephens to the Shoalhaven. To recognise that metropolitan New South Wales is both one region, but comprised of 6 unique and diverse cities representing delightfully different communities. The idea of the mega region is one that's well understood among planners, even if it's slipped slightly out of vogue in recent years. It's been promoted in past plans for Sydney. The Sydney Region Outline Plan of 1968, for example, prioritised, and I quote, developing the Sydney-Newcastle-Wollongong area as one interrelated linear urban complex with special emphasis on a north-south communications corridor linking the 3 areas. These ideas are not new. Around the world, planners have used the mega region model to interpret the economic success of places like the Ruhr Valley in Germany and the Pearl River Delta of China and Hong Kong. Just yesterday, it was the centenary of the Regional Plan Association in the United States that first envisaged the tri-state mega region of 12,000 square kilometres and 24 million people based around New York, New Jersey and Connecticut. The Randstad city region of the Netherlands is particularly instructive for our context. It concentrates a huge share of the Netherlands' population in a small geographical area, bound and interspersed by green space and natural hazards, and globally connected as a hub for air and sea transport. As Sir Peter Hall and Mark Toyota-Jones explained, the Randstad is not only polycentric in a physical nature, but in a functional sense too. Amsterdam is the focus for finance, retailing, tourism and culture. Rotterdam is the port, for port, business and heavy industry. The Hague for government and administration. This approach could be useful for us to define the roles for our 6 cities. It can also help to recognise, respect and harness the strong parochial identities of Newcastle, Wollongong and the Central Coast as they're brought into the mega region. Newcastle and Wollongong serving as northern and southern gateways, as ports and centres of industrial innovation. The Central Coast reinforcing its role as a lifestyle city, the Eastern Harbour City of Sydney being a centre for finance and global trade, the Central River City as a place of government and services, whilst the Parkland City in the west emerges as an aerotropolis, just as Schiphol is for the Randstad. While some city regions are shaped more by happenstance, others have a clear geographic identity. The Randstad is so named because it resembled a ring or ring city to the early aviator who first coined the name. The Committee for Sydney similarly observed that our metropolitan cities are shaped as a sandstone mega region, taking its shape and its identity, even the vernacular of some of our most iconic architecture, from the ancient geology and mighty rivers that have supported and incubated human civilization here since the time of the dreaming. But a great title and a great plan only take us so far. Australian urbanist Marcus Spiller noted that there's no problem in this country with writing good metropolitan strategies. Where the nation has a problem is taking these plans into action. A great strength of the existing Greater Sydney Commission is how its governance model integrates state and local representatives, so both levels of government share responsibility to solve common challenges. In the Hunter, for example, we've seen significant bottom-up progress with the government working together with the Hunter Joint Organisations of Councils to deliver the Greater Newcastle Metropolitan Plan and the Hunter Region Plan. We need to retain and strengthen such collaborative approaches as we develop the Greater Cities model as well. Like collaboration, connectivity too will help draw together the 6 cities mega-region. There are huge opportunities to improve connections between centres to benefit each city's competitive advantages. For example, better transport connections between Wollongong with its renowned university and remarkable natural environment could benefit Western Sydney with a massive population and significant global connections through the new airport and vice versa. But there's a paradox driven by the pandemic, as we saw in the analysis provided by Asan a little earlier. As remote working makes moving to the regions more attractive, it may undermine the imperative for faster transit connections if people are working in centres less frequently. If infrastructure is to help drive our economic recovery out of the pandemic, it needs to do so in an intelligent and thoughtful way, reflective of our post-pandemic world and the way in which we choose to move around. Multiple minor projects, as well as major mega projects, might be just as important in building sustainable cities. Which brings me to active transport. Active transport or active mobility projects, walking and cycling infrastructure, are smaller projects with big benefits. While perhaps surprising in the context of a global pandemic, the leading cause of death globally is not infectious disease, but non-communicable diseases like coronary heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and breast and colon cancers. The impact and incidence of all these diseases is exacerbated by inactivity. Making it easier and safer and more attractive for all of us to walk, stroll, run and ride will make us live longer and better. Yet our cities were designed at a time when society and medicine both frowned on exercise. Bed rest was the prescription for many non-communicable diseases. Women in particular were discouraged from physical exercise, and simple pleasures like going for a swim in a river or at the beach was banned in daylight hours. We have a big job ahead of us in reshaping our built environment and even the cultural biases of our communities to make active transport as much a day-to-day part of our lives as in so many other successful cities around the globe. And the pandemic has ignited this change. During COVID-19, the number of people riding a bicycle or going for a walk increased across the existing network of paths and cycleways in Greater Sydney. In June 2020, Sydney Harbour Bridge cycleways saw a 3% increase in bike riders from the same time the previous year, but despite a complete collapse in the number of workers going to the CBD during this time. The M4 cycleway at Parramatta saw a 200% increase in riders. Hawthorn Canal in Leichhardt saw a 170% increase. The Como Bridge at Oatley saw a 70% increase in riders compared to the same time last year. Bicycle retailers across the state are out of stock. While supply chain issues are partly to blame, it's also due to an enormous increase in demand. A survey by Bicycle Industries Australia found between January and June last year, bike sales more than doubled when compared with the same period 2 years previously. This shift in thinking is reflected in the life cycle of this government. Years ago, we were ripping up cycleways in Sydney's CBD. Now we're building new ones. And I stand before you today as the state's first dedicated minister for active transport. Our pedestrian and cycling networks are true public goods, non-exclusive and non-rivalrous. It's contingent on government to provide these services. Because they're public goods, there's little private sector incentive to do so, and because providing these services generate a multitude of benefits for the whole community. I've already mentioned the health benefits of active mobility, but there are wider benefits as well. It improves air quality and combats climate change. It activates high streets and can help build community and address inequality, as well as making our communities safer, which again showed up as one of the things that Sydneysiders are concerned about. Significantly, it can liberate the citizens of our cities to live freer and less congested lives. American planner Jarrett Walker observed how traditional thinking about transport planning is primarily a problem of spatial geometry above anything else. So what he means is that cities exist where people come together, yet if we all bring 2-ton, 10 square metre metal boxes with us, there simply doesn't leave space to accommodate the benefits of cities. Our traditional methods of transport planning are built on forecast models, essentially forcing people into modes and directions of travel that our major infrastructure is designed to cater for, not for where people may choose to go. Instead, we need to bring freedom in how we talk about transport. Active transport allows citizens of all abilities and means to be free to choose where they want to go. Enrique Peñalosa, the former mayor of Bogota, talks about how investing in footpaths and cycleways is an act of democracy. Because at some point each day, while not all of us can drive or ride, all of us, regardless of age or ability, at some point are going to be users of the footpath. Active transport is a powerful means for people to experience public life. Public space isn't just the green spaces and open plazas. It's all those connections where we see, hear and feel like we're part of a public process, not trapped alone in the air-conditioned, desensitised sterility of our private cars. By providing for individual mobility and autonomy, we're letting the citizens of New South Wales be free in their own cities and their own towns. For instance, it's too common to see across New South Wales local streets and neighbourhoods bereft of footpaths. For children, for older people, parents pushing trams or people with disabilities, the lack of a footpath isn't an inconvenience, it's a barrier to moving freely in public space. It's a barrier to their full participation as citizens of this state. It keeps people locked in their homes or dependent on external services, particularly if they don't have the means of the private motor car to get around. So how do we encourage more people not only to choose active transport to get around, but demand more active transport infrastructure? Well, we need to invest to prove it works for people. To quote the mysterious voice speaking to Kevin Costner in Field of Dreams, build it and they will come. And it's true, you go to the Bay Run, you go to the Narrabeen Lagoon track, you go to the Bungarraby track in Western Sydney Parklands, you see that when these places exist, they are used, and they're used incredibly well. Currently, about $950 million is being invested over the next 5 years for walking and cycling infrastructure. That already represents a considerable growth in funding of more than an additional $200 million just over the last few months. Over the past financial year, we've delivered 55 kilometres in new cycleways. We have a policy of incorporating active transport into all our major infrastructure projects. Nearly 2/3 of our active transport budget is new walking and cycling links leveraged alongside major infrastructure projects. This represents the largest commitment to active mobility in the state's history, but it's nowhere near enough. It's my view that we should see that investment more than double over the next few years. It's time to start rebalancing our infrastructure priorities. Major roads are important, which is why we're spending $23 billion over 4 years on major road expansions. But if we can find $23 billion to benefit 5.9 million registered vehicles in New South Wales, then we need to spend more than a fraction of this amount on the active mobility paths, shared paths and cycleways that can benefit the 8.2 million pedestrians in New South Wales. Major projects can be great to form the arteries of a whole new network of walkways and cycleways across Sydney. To that end, we'll start work on a great walking and cycling parkway connecting the Sydney CBD to the Parramatta CBD. Much like the Great North Road of colonial days that followed an ancient artery of Aboriginal active mobility, or the Great West Walk that connects Parramatta to the foothills of the Blue Mountains. An active path from Sydney to Parramatta will shape not just how we get around, but our land use decisions. It'll make it easier for people to move freely around their city, our city. It's an ambitious and monumental task, and it won't be realised overnight, but it's exactly the type of infrastructure we must strive for. People are already seeing the benefits of dedicated active transport lanes on our public roads, which are fundamentally public spaces. They belong to all of us. A good example is the pop-up cycleway on Pitt Street, which has not only become a popular route for bike riders, but also allowed outdoor dining to spill out further onto a space that was previously reserved for private vehicles and buses. This shift in thinking regarding active transport has been profound. Anne Hidalgo, the Mayor of Paris, has led active transport infrastructure to make up half of that city's infrastructure investment budget, creating 659 new kilometres of new cycleways in the wake of the pandemic. But that's also meant removing 72% of Paris's on-street car parking spaces. These are difficult decisions that create vexed problems for all of us to solve. Do investments like this mean we've won the battle of hearts and minds and bike lanes and footpaths will be welcomed everywhere across the state? Absolutely not. Beyond investment, we need to also appeal to and convince those people who don't choose active transport methods every day. As Active Transport Minister, I don't need to do much to convince more middle-aged men in Lycra to pick up cycling. But across our state, people who have previously shunned bike riding and seen it as the domain of inner-city elites, or who find it difficult for mobility issues to even walk around, are increasingly walking or riding bicycles for exercise or just for simply getting around, and demanding better connections in their neighbourhood. For other segments of society, the risks of active transport are perceived as too great. Think about those of us who don't feel safe riding in shared roadways or walking alone at night or even during the day in some parts of our great city. Think about people trying to manage getting whole families around who may not have the convenience of end-of-trip facilities at their workplace. Parents worried for their children's safety, sharing road space with others. We need to make everyone feel comfortable, confident and safe while undertaking active transport. We need to clear up regulations around e-scooters and electric skateboards, an area where the regulation is no longer reflective of what society demands. And we need to make pathways safer and more attractive to people living with disabilities. They have the same rights to access active mobility as everyone else. We can't create an inclusive city without providing access for all. I strive to see our cities boast active transport infrastructure so good that walking and cycling become more popular modes of transport than using a public vehicle for local trips. We need to look not only at the major projects, but also invest in the pinch points that break up active transport links. Too often we see footpaths or cycleways that end without notice or transition. These are hazards that make it too difficult for people to get around actively. While the big major projects are the ones that get the headlines, just as important are the missing links and local projects that stitch our city together. I just want to end with one anecdote. In June last year, I opened a fairly small shared path in Artarmon in a new priority precinct there, or planned precinct there, that connected to the broader active transport network. While there, I met a local woman named Steph. Steph was aged in her mid-50s, in fact she was happy for me to share with you, and had only just started riding an e-bike in the previous 2 years. She described herself as never being a sporty type or someone who went to the gym, but thanks to the gradual build-up of the local network, she could now ride her e-bike from her home in Roseville to her work in Parramatta every day. Her daily commute would take in the beautiful surrounds of Lane Cove National Park, North Ryde, Meadowbank and the stunning new Parramatta River Boardwalk. She said the investment in the active transport network had completely changed her life, her physical health and mental well-being, her confidence and even her productivity at work. This is fantastic for Steph, and we need to ensure that more people across our state, particularly in Western Sydney, where the distances are longer but the terrain is flatter, can share the same experience. The challenge before us is to make today's generation of risk-averse parents feel more confident allowing their kids to ride bikes or to walk to school or around the neighbourhood rather than spending their spare time staring at screens. And for all of us to consider walking or bike riding as a primary mode of transport for local trips rather than using a private vehicle. We'll be talking to transport planners, infrastructure experts, city leaders and the community about the opportunities and obstacles for active transport links right across New South Wales and particularly in the greater cities region. For too long, roads have divided our cities and suburbs, making them less safe, less attractive and less accessible. To make an even better sandstone city region, we need to recognise in all of the infrastructure we need: education, housing, health, arts, public and private transport. Sometimes the sum total of the smaller bits, the parks and the paths, can be a secret to a city's success. Thanks.
Minister, thank you for your speech. There were some exciting ideas in there and bonus points for Kevin Costner reference as well. I've been watching some questions come in on Slido, but we could do with some more. So please, while we're chatting, grab your phones and ask away. I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm Bevan Shields. I'm the new editor of the Sydney Morning Herald. I've just returned to Sydney after a 2-year posting in COVID-ravaged London. And a lot of the issues, I think, facing Sydney at the moment post-COVID, I've seen play out in London over that time. It's great to be back in Sydney. I love Sydney, and so does the Herald. As a shameless plug for the Herald, we've been serving Sydney for 190 years, which is a pretty remarkable number when you think of it. And coverage of Sydney, this great city that we live and work and move around in and look at, is a real personal priority for me this year, and we'll be doing a lot more on it. But I'll start with, I think we've got 10 minutes, which isn't much, but we will do our best. I think you get more time at speed dating than we will here, but 10 minutes it is. Just one for me, first off. One thing you can't accuse this government of is not building things. You've been building lots of stuff, but budgets are under pressure at the moment. And I wonder, given that, whether you can offer a guarantee that every project that's on the drawing board, on the agenda at the moment, can be delivered on schedule and will happen, or are there some tough decisions you will have to make?
A fundamental point of government is we need to keep our promises to the community. So when we've committed to something, a hallmark of this government has been we've delivered it. And I saw, coming into public life in opposition, I saw that one of the reasons that the last government failed was because it didn't deliver the things it had committed to. So we have to find pathways to deliver on our commitments, but we also need to be alive to the fact that preferences have changed. There's been significant modal shift, and projects that may have made a great deal of sense even 5 years ago, some of the dynamics around them have shifted, which might have implications for timing and those sorts of things. We've also got this, again, exquisite challenge that every government everywhere around the world is addressing some of the challenges we've faced as a result of the pandemic with stimulatory projects like infrastructure projects. So we're literally all competing against each other for the same cranes, for the same engineers, for the same gyprock. So we're pushing prices up because we're competing against one another, all using taxpayer money to do so. So the way in which we can better calibrate our efforts across the nation state and across the world will actually allow for a stronger pipeline, more consistent employment opportunities for people in the infrastructure industry, and also put downward pressure on the costs that ultimately have to be borne by the taxpayer.
Is there already an announced project that you are having a close second look at that you can give us an example?
Well, I mean, we're looking literally forensically at every project all the time, and one of the lesser known roles of Infrastructure New South Wales is doing that project assurance and managing our project pipeline. And we have a cabinet infrastructure committee now, an infrastructure committee now of the cabinet, which Dom Perrottet has re-established, and its job is to forensically look at our infrastructure program to ensure it's delivered on time and on budget, despite the pressures around it. But I think one of the opportunities to look at is, I mean, we've seen historically mega projects are often where the blowouts in time and costs are concerned because they're so big and there's so many variables. But some of the projects we need to look at, and something I found during my tenure as Education Minister, are the mid-sized projects that second and third tier companies might want to take on, like school builds, for example. Yep. And that's what's so attractive about so many of these active transport projects as well, because they provide opportunity for the non-major players, which are just as important in providing that pipeline of jobs and opportunity.
We will whip through some questions. Very interesting one from Anonymous. Hello, Anonymous. Where do you stand on legalising e-scooters and skateboards? And if you are supportive, what's your timeline to make that change?
So I have to confess I have a conflict of interest here. I have children who are lobbying me on these issues every day, as I suspect many in this room do. I think clearly, this is one of these areas of disruption where governments have to respond. We can't bury our heads in the sand and say it's not going to happen. It is happening already, so we need to ensure that it happens smoothly and safely. There's a lot of work going on within the Department of Transport to find appropriate regulation for these sorts of technologies, and we'll look to roll them out as pilots in the first instance. Instinctively, I get a little bit concerned about some of the hire schemes I've seen operating in different cities. The last thing we want to do is see scooters and skateboards in trees. When people own this infrastructure, the lived experiences, they tend to look after it better than some of the hire schemes. But we'll be looking at all options. But the short answer is yes, we will be looking at how we can appropriately regulate the use of these modes of transport that are being used anyway.
Gabrielle mentioned half of Sydney's future population growth could fit along the future metro lines. Do you agree with that? Is that the approach you'll be taking?
Yeah, I entirely agree with Gabrielle. The biggest thing that is happening in this city and indeed in the mega region over the next few years is metro. Metro will shift everything. One of the biggest and most exciting projects anywhere in the world will be the Hunter Street Station development, which sits at the apex of all those lines. But the opportunities for growth and change along these corridors is incredible. But to realise it, remember, part of it is a modal shift away from private motor vehicles. So you need the mass transit option, and that's why I'm deliberately choosing to talk about active transport today, because you can't achieve that without also facilitating those in last mile. I don't know we call them last mile projects because we don't use miles, but those short journeys that you're not necessarily going to be taking by mass transit, but we want you to shift away from a motor vehicle. One of the things that I was really stunned with when we were doing the planning around Parramatta Road for the transformation of land use around that route was that I can't remember the statistic off the top of my head, but it was something like 50% of road journeys along Parramatta Road were 3 kilometres or less.
Wow.
Because the environment was so hostile that if you were dropping the kids to the school or picking up some milk, you'd take the car and not walk. And so that's just unnecessary congestion that's costing all of us. Imagine the productivity costs of those journeys, which are only necessary because no one's thought sort of consciously about how to make those local connections more attractive.
This is the age-old question. How would you say we should address the mindset of people in the east versus west and vice versa? Peter Shergold was in the Sydney Morning Herald on Saturday talking about this issue. So I'll just add to this question. Are people in the east snobs? Is it up to people in the east to lead the mindset shift rather than the other way around?
The challenge we have, and there's a whole range of historical reasons for this, I actually think tax policy has a fair bit to do with it, that has actually segregated our housing markets as much as anything else. Yep. And my worry, you go to many global cities, you go to Berlin, you go to London, you go to Shanghai, you've got rich and poor living alongside one another right across the fabric of a city. What is, I think, and I share Peter's concern here, is that is not that is not necessarily the reality in Sydney, but it risks becoming more of a reality without some conscious effort. I mean, one of the things that this government has really sought to do is build those connections so that the burgeoning suburbs of the west aren't just left as dormitory suburbs providing workers for jobs in the east, but actually getting the jobs in the west as well. Ultimately, it still comes down to that jobs piece, which is about providing more jobs in areas that were conceived as dormitory suburbs because not much thought was put into their development. But we do, as I inferred in the speech, we've got the beauty in this city of polycentricity. We've got some really interesting urban centres. In fact, some of the old Macquarie towns, like places like Campbelltown or Richmond, or maybe not so much Richmond, but Campbelltown, certainly Liverpool, they've got these beautiful hoddle grids. They're really gritty, granular urban spaces that lend themselves to really effective reinvention, and they are in the process of reinventing themselves, and that's where the real opportunity is. But it has to be led by jobs.
Just in the active transport space and back to cycling in a way. I mean, are you rethinking the mandatory helmet regulation to increase cycling take-up? Is that something you are prepared to think about?
That's Sir Humphrey would call that a courageous decision, because of course the reality is, we are in a risky society and there are risks around us every day. But bicycle helmets are one really good way to manage a foreseeable risk. It's interesting. The research shows that if you have an accident on a bicycle, if you're wearing a helmet, you are less likely to suffer catastrophic injury as a result of crash. But if you're not wearing a helmet, you're less likely to crash. This is the challenge we face. I don't propose to do anything adventurous in that space, because ultimately we want to encourage people to wear helmets.
Yep. Another good one. We're getting close to time, but deadlines are flexible, so we'll go over a little bit. Why not put in place congestion charging for peak hours if you are as concerned as you seem to be about the huge uptick in car use over the past couple of years?
Well, this is one of these tricky areas where I'm not a commentator, I'm a participant. As a commentator, I might have a different view as I do as a participant, because of course that's something we need to look to do, but there needs to be strong community acceptance of those sorts of moves. And to do that, before we can get there, we need to ensure that we have the mass transit options to provide the alternative. When we came to government, that was those mass transit options simply weren't there. They weren't good enough. We are progressing strongly toward their achievement, and I believe once the metro lines are finished, we will be in a position where we can have those discussions, but we're simply not there yet.
It will take guts. I mean, does the government have guts to talk about that?
Well, I think one of the things, I'm happy to have a chat about it. I think I know what the answer will be, though, from the community at this stage, and because they will have the reasonable view that until there are those mass transit options, well, how are we supposed to get to work? And I think that's, and those mass transit options are being built right now, but they will take time. But we've already seen, I mean, with one of the great unintended benefits, well, I think it was actually intended benefits of the light rail through Sydney was actually displacing the traffic along George Street. Yep. And we've seen, I mean, people can actually have the lived experience of seeing what this looks like. Yep. And people will resist these things until they see the consequences. A personal anecdote, I'm a member for Pittwater, so we bought the B line bus up to Mona Vale. I remember when we were bringing that bus up there was a massive public rally. People were saying it was a Trojan horse for overdevelopment. I even had constituents chaining themselves up trees to stop the buses. And now that the bus interchange is there in Mona Vale, it's seen a remarkable modal shift and a great urban environment that's been created as a result of that public transport initiative. And I've learnt from first hand that while people may resist these things, if there's solid research and data to inform a decision, provided people have been appropriately consulted, on the other side they'll see the benefits.
We might just do two more, and here's a good one, a good chance for you to put the boot into Melbourne, if you like. Why do you argue the structure of Sydney's multiple CBDs is fundamentally stronger than Melbourne? Because according to the questioner, some would say Melbourne's single buzzy CBD is actually its strength as a city. So
I think one of the lived experiences of a pandemic is if one of the challenges to future-proof cities and build resilience to these sorts of events in future is to ensure that we have an urban form that doesn't require everyone to go to the same space all at the same time to access goods and services. Even things like major hospitals and so forth, it's good to have them spread out over the urban fabric so that when we have these sorts of challenges, we're not exacerbating them by putting everyone in the same place at the same time. Yep.
Last one. Let's pick a good one. I mean, they're all good. They're all great. The City of Sydney recently had its new LEP gazetted, which actually encourages less housing in Sydney's CBD. So how does this square with the goal of more affordable housing?
Okay, I don't necessarily accept the premise of the question. The LEP does provide for additional housing in the City of Sydney. One of the challenges here, and this is one of the lived experiences of planning policy, strategic planning takes a long time to germinate. And I think what happened was we had the plan for Sydney was largely developed pre-pandemic, and I think all the players were so sick of it by the end they just wanted it finalised. So there was some certainty, but as soon as, of course, what's the old quote? No plan survives the plans are useless, planning is everything, or whatever it is. So ultimately, it's an iterative process. We now need to re-engage on some of those instruments to see how we can liberate some more residential floor space in Sydney's CBD, and that's why. One intervention I was really keen on promoting during my time as Planning Minister was build to rent, and also ensuring that build to rent development could be provided in commercial buildings, because that allows, one of the challenges with residential floor space is, of course, once an area goes residential and is strated, it can't ratchet back into another land use. It's residential forever. So a build to rent style development still allows for residential uses, and sure, if the requirement for commercial floor space re-emerges at some point in the future, that land is then convertible back. But it's clear to me that if we're going to bring more people back into our CBDs, which we urgently need to do, we need to be more creative than just putting a coffee cart down the bottom of a commercial building. We need to find more ways for people to live and work in CBDs, and that may mean interventions, for example, like providing housing for people who may want to live regionally and come in to work intensively in the CBD for 2 or 3 days a week, to provide housing options for them, where you might have a tenancy for 7 days a week may not make commercial sense, but if you could share a tenancy for 2 or 3 days each, or have those sorts of uses, which you're not going to require car parking for, and you're not necessarily going to require extensive kitchen facilities and those sorts of things. So the way in which people live post-pandemic is going to be quite different, and that needs to be reflected in the way we plan for people living in our CBDs.
Minister, thank you. We are well over time, but that's fine. Thank you. I have to say, before I went to London, I did 5 years in the Press Gallery in Canberra, which was sort of an ordeal. And, I've seen a lot of ministers who have portfolios who don't really seem to get it and don't have a particular personal interest in it. I think, you clearly do, and that's very energising and great to see. So thank you. If everyone can thank the Minister as he leaves the stage, that'd be great.
Thank you.